Today I'm speaking with Gayle Jordan. Gayle, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
And we've been working to speak for a few weeks here, and I really appreciate the chance to finally speak with you and just to get together. And I did want to give a brief bio for Gayle before we pass it back to you to fill us in on some stuff we don't know about you. Gayle is the mother of four, and I know you were in Tennessee, but where are you now?
Oregon.
Oregon. And what part of Oregon?
I'm in sort of southern Oregon. I'm in Roseburg, Oregon, which is on the west side of the Cascades, about an hour and a half inland from the coast.
Nice. And do you still have a farm, by the way,
I
there?
sold the farm in Tennessee and I bought about 5 acres out here in Oregon. So it's not quite the same farm. It's on a hillside, which is new to me. And the whole ecosystem is different to me, it's still farm-ish. I have goats and chickens. So that's a farm, right?
Nice. That's awesome. I'm jealous.
That's
We're aiming
awesome.
for that at some point. And you're a former attorney and as well as a personal trainer. Is that correct?
I'm a former personal trainer. I'm a current attorney.
Current attorney. Okay.
Mhm.
And I was going to say, with the personal trainer, do you also are very physically active yourself in terms of different kinds of exercise and sports?
Yes, and I hope that that comes out sometime in the podcast. That's a part of my experience. Regaining my fitness was part of my recovery from religion.
Hmm. Interesting. Yeah. Well, let's definitely get into that.
Mhm.
And then you also are a blogger. You blog about life and family and personal training, as well as secularism on your blog, which I'll have the link for below our video. It's
Sure.
gaylejordan.net. And you call your blog Happy, Healthy Heathen. I like that.
Correct.
And perhaps what you're most known for at least for my audience, is you're the executive director at Recovering from Religion. And
Yes.
how long have you been there?
6 years.
Well, I'm sure you've seen amazing things in those 6 years. That's awesome.
It inspires me every day.
That's awesome. Can I ask, before we get back to your bio, for Recovering from Religion, would you say that they're very different than when you started? Has it kind of, either grown in numbers or just dynamics?
Sure, sure. The whole nonprofit, we're a 501(c)(3). The whole nonprofit has grown. It's been very organic. Every project and every outgrowth that we have had has been wrapped around how we can help folks. I know we'll talk about recovering from religion later on. We're not a deconversion process. I almost always have to issue that disclaimer, but we're all about providing help. Our mission statement is straightforward. We provide hope, healing, and support to folks who are struggling with issues of doubt and non-belief. So
Hmm.
it's resources and support groups and all such as that.
That's awesome. That's
Mhm.
awesome. And in terms of your background, I know you're a we're a Southern Baptist. And so at that point, that's the extent of most of what I know about you, apart from you also ran for state office in Tennessee, which we'll get into. But could you fill us in on anything else you're doing professional wise or personally?
Oh my goodness. Well, that's a lot. My legal practice, I'm an estate planning attorney, so I help with trusts and wills and healthcare directives, all the things that are bundled into that. And then my work at Recovering from Religion, of course, and then my home is it's consuming because it's exciting to be in a new place. I've been here almost a year, but we've had to do a lot of land clearing and fencing and as you mentioned, it's rural. I have goats and chickens, and I have a garden, and it's all those kinds of things nurture me as much as I nurture them. And in the past, I have been a whole lot more physically active than I am now. I've done competitive endurance events, triathlons and races and that kind of thing. We haven't done it so much out here, mostly because of COVID. We've just been trying to be as safe as possible. We haven't explored our area like we want to. So I haven't done that as much, but I have every intention of getting back into it. And that kind of wraps me up.
That's awesome. That's a lot of stuff.
Uh-huh.
And you're the mother of four. Your kids are grown now?
They're grown. They're awesome kids. My oldest is the reason I moved out here to Oregon was to be closer to the children. I raised them in Tennessee, but along with their story, which I'll tell in a little bit, they moved to more progressive places. They were sort of over the whole Tennessee experience. And so my oldest is a public defender in the state of Washington. So he's several hours drive from me. My next oldest boy is finishing his PhD at Arizona State. He's an ecologist. And then I have twin daughters, one of whom is a performer in Las Vegas. And she eventually, that's a career that has a shelf life, as you can expect, as a performer. She's a model and a dancer and some other things. And when that plays out for her, she'd like to move up to the Pacific Northwest. And then her twin, my last one, it lives about an hour from me, which just saying the words just lights me up. Since my children were in high school, I haven't lived close to them. And now I'm right here in the big middle of them. And she's the executive director of a nonprofit that works with young adults with autism. So the children are, it's just, that's why I'm out here is marinating in the Jordan children.
That's awesome. Very cool.
Yeah.
I'm in that other side where we're all not too close to my mom, and we would love to be able to live closer to her. We're from Philadelphia, and so I'm here in Atlanta. I've got a brother over in North Carolina. I've got a sister up in New York. So it's interesting. Yeah, it is a nice ideal if you can to live close by.
It's a mixed bag. It's a mixed bag sometimes with family, but with the kids, there was there was just no question. Once they sort of began to settle and get into their professions, I was just not going to be in Tennessee. They abandoned me, left me in Tennessee, and I just was not going to do it. So it made the move out here so exciting. It's awesome to be out here.
Well, that's awesome. Well, I did want to start by just kind of asking to give you the floor to tell us where you're coming from in terms of your spiritual background, your worldview. What was some of the earliest stuff that you were exposed to as a child?
Sure. I come from a long lineage of Southern Baptist, and people that are Southern Baptist understand the language, the RAs and GAs and actines and Bible study and youth retreats and all of the pieces of it. And I was, my family before me were Southern Baptist. My grandfather was a Southern Baptist preacher. The whole thing.
Wow.
So I met who would become my husband at Ridgecrest Baptist Conference Center in North Carolina. My parents met there. So, I mean, I was, that's my street cred for being a Southern Baptist. My former husband and I had 4 children pretty quickly. We had them in church every time. We were one of those families. Every time the doors were open, we were there. The children did Bible drill, and my husband was a deacon and chairman of the deacons. I didn't get to do that because I'm a girl, and girls can't do certain things in Southern Baptist, but I taught Sunday school. I even had to go before the deacons and get special permission to teach college Sunday school, because the question was, are college males men? Because women can't teach men. And so I could teach all the way up to high school, but then when there was a need in the college department, and I said, yeah, I'll do it. I'll step up because that's way who I am. And then I had to go before this council, and there was big drama. And, I look back on those things. Anyway, that chased a rabbit there for a minute. So we had our children in everything in youth group, and my children are close together. As I said, I had 4 children in about 3 years. And so they all entered the youth group within a couple of years of one another. And at one point, they came to me with what I considered pretty routine Christian youth group questions. They ask about the morality of the Bible, bashing the infants' heads on the rocks, and taking the young women as your bounty, and the boat, and the 6,000 years, and the anti-science, and I told them those were good questions. I had taught these children to be relentless in their pursuit of truth, and I said those are good questions. For some reason, when I myself had those questions, it was sufficient for me to accept the party line, which religion does have an answer to those questions. It's not they're not satisfying answers. God's ways are higher than our ways, whatever. But when my children asked me, it just wasn't enough for me to placate them with that. So I said, let's see if we can find out. So the first place we looked was what I call inside the bubble. We went to our Sunday school teachers and youth pastor and our pastor and asked those questions. And again, answers, terrible answers, but they got answers. And it just wasn't satisfying. And about that time, the children were starting high school. They were starting to be exposed of, we were in a little rural area in Tennessee. So their elementary school and middle school years were with other people that were just like us. But once they got to high school, even though we were not in a very metropolitan area, they still got exposed to people of other beliefs, other races. So that was simultaneously happening with our exploration. And once we started looking at anthropology and history and comparative religions and science, and we started looking at it, the children, one by one, each according to their personality and kind of their birth order, started falling away. Depending upon who they were, on how they dealt with it. Some were angry and vocal, some were less, were more passive and introspective, but they they all gradually began to step away. I was actually the last one.
Was it scary for you as you saw
Oh, it
them
was
do that?
terrifying. And my former husband was so uncomfortable with the whole process. And although we had been partners in raising the children and we had done well with that, he didn't feel like he could help us with it. He said, I think you're playing with fire. I think this is dangerous. He was right. He said, this is very dangerous. You're encouraging them to ask questions. And even though religion has this superficial, it's perfectly fine for you to doubt and ask questions. They certainly want to let you know what the outcome of those questions are going to be. So as I said, it's superficial. It's not genuine, and he felt like I was taking it too far. Once we asked the first round of questions, he was ready for us to be done. So he couldn't accompany us, which began to create a huge gap between the children and him and he and I, and that whole drama. But so toward the end, the children, now this is over years of the children's, teenagerhood, the children stepped away one at a time. And about that time, they were starting to finish one by one, starting to finish high school. And I'm hanging on. I'm still trying. I guess if I were to look at it, and I've put so much of that behind me, if I were to examine it, I was trying to believe. I don't think I thought I believed, but I was teaching Sunday school. I was trying to hold on to the whole thing. I knew the children were leaving. I knew that my marriage was going to be at risk. I knew my entire community was going to be at risk. And so whether I consciously did it or not, I was trying to hold on. And I probably went about a year too long. The kids were just finishing high school and I was in a hot mess. I was drinking a lot because I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to do. The children were not as quite as vested. So when they left, they were careful with their dad but they were ready to launch. They were going to build their whole new community. They were, it wasn't as difficult I don't want to say it wasn't as difficult for them because they share with me it was difficult for them, but it wasn't the same scenario that I had. So after that year, and it was such a mess, I just threw up my hands and I knew everything was going to change. And I was right. My marriage didn't survive. I did the thing that middle-aged ladies do. I reinvented myself. I turned around and attended law school after my divorce. I attended law school and became an attorney and did the whole thing. And, that's awfully condensed, but that's sort of the process of how I did that. And so I began a new life. When I left the religion, the only non-believers I knew personally and had a relationship with were my 4 children. And so it was picking up the pieces and sort of starting over. I lived close enough to Nashville to be a part of some Nashville secular groups, Nashville Atheist, different things. I would have to drive up there for an hour, but it meant something to me because this was going to be who I was. And so I did that. And then I started a little secular group, a meetup secular group in my own small town south of Nashville. And the rest, as they say, is history. And it has it has a beautifully happy ending. It's glorious on this side. I think in my, one of the things I repeatedly say, there is so much more light and air and space on this side. And it's not perfect, of course, but I made the decision to step away from religion without knowing that. And so it was terrifying. Now that I know that, I try to live my life in such a way that shows that you can live a fulfilling and joyful, albeit imperfect life without religion and without belief in a deity and all of the things. But at the time, you're right, it's absolutely terrifying.
Well, I've got so many questions from what you covered a lot there quickly. I wanted to go back just a few steps if I could. You mentioned your grandfather was a preacher. Do you remember hearing him actually preach?
Oh my goodness, yes. And this was very rural Kentucky. He had an 8th grade education, and it was the typical thing. I say he was a preacher. It was these little teeny tiny churches. And so he took his turn preaching. And of course it was the standard fare. And back then, this would have been in the 60s, it was all was all just negative. It was all horrible, horrible, horrible. You do these things or God's going to do this. There was very little joy baked into those kinds of sermons. This was the era of revival meetings and things like that. And so, I have the perspective of it as a child, like my ages 0 to 10 memories of that. And I just remember, it was the standard line. It was certainly, you're going to burn in hell if you don't repent. And, you know, there's such a narrow path of being. You can't divert from this path. And so I couldn't have articulated it as a child, but as I look back on it now, it was just all awful. It was just all the horrible things that are going to happen to you if you don't conform and do right.
Yeah. It's amazing to me when you're in it, and I mean just totally in it, especially as a young person, you're not exposed to other perspectives. Even within the Christian community, it's like this is the truth in the sense of Christianity is true, but it's also like this version of Christianity is probably the closest to honoring God. And you grow up in it and you just think these are the salt of the earth people. And I've had a lot of people say, well, people are just doing the best with what they've got. And I get that. But there is a part of me that does sometimes cringe and think, I'd like to hope more and more for our society, as it's at least in the future, that, and I think we're getting better at this in a lot of levels, but just that when injustices or just bad ideas are out there, that we kind of step up and say, it really doesn't matter if this is what my parents or my community or my, just the society believes. Like, it's okay to say, I'm going to buck this system because this is a really bad idea. This is a
This is
really
a
bad
bad
teaching.
idea.
And
Well, and
it's,
that's the power of indoctrination, because I
yeah,
think if you're introduced to those ideas in a more rational way, where you haven't been hearing this since birth, you can recognize a bad idea when you see it. Or at least I would hope to think that we've developed those critical thinking skills to the point that we do take a step back and go, wait, this is not great. But the power of indoctrination is those horrible ideas, they're so embedded, and they bypassed, when we were children, they bypassed our critical thinking net, our filter, and they
yes.
and they got embedded. And now I think you're right. I think we do better now, and I would like to think that we're continuing to do better. I hope that we are, but you're absolutely right.
Yeah, yeah. At least they're calling out some of the injustices and bad things in our world. I love, on that note, and I'll move on to my next question in a second. But I love too just the idea of giving kids the idea from a young age that they do have that power. Where you mentioned, we're often raised in a way that bypasses that, but to tell kids you have the power. And I like it in a lot to how we're all much more conscious these days of giving kids the power to say no about body autonomy stuff, where if uncle so and so wants
Sure.
to give you a hug, even if he's truly the nicest guy in the world, if you as a little girl want to say no thank you, then that's the final word. You don't get a hug. You get to choose who touches you and gives you a hug. And it's like that kind of has a correspondence with your brain too. Like, you get to decide who gets to um, tell you, or you get to decide what you want to believe. You're going to have to listen to different people's perspectives. You're going to have to listen to the people at the church and the politician on the news, and your parents and your friends. You do have to listen to it verbally, but that doesn't mean you have to believe it, especially with the insinuation of, if you don't accept it and believe like me, you have eternal damnation as your final outcome.
And
And
Tim, I find myself experiencing a little bit of envy with you, with your children being as young as they are. Everybody that I knew, that I grew up with, we raised all of our children religious, and you don't have those wide open teachable moments, when you raise religious children. As I said, the path is narrow, and you don't get to say, tell me your thoughts and feelings about this, or tell me if you think, would this hurt your feelings, or all of the things that we do as parents, that it's our job to do when we raise children in religion. It's just, you just don't get to ask that many questions. And raising free thinking children from a young age, I think about your wide open opportunity to get to not just influence the children, which is your job and your privilege and your responsibility, but to get to participate and watch that develop, watch their little minds begin to absorb humanism, and how must it feel, and teaching them empathy, and teaching them, how do you think that person feels when they're experiencing, fill in the blank. You have an entire universe open to you, and I wish you the best, but I'm also watching you from a distance and observing and thinking, what what a joy that you get to participate in that.
Yeah, it really is. It's a privilege, and it's also, I think, extra necessary for those of us who are in a situation where you have parents that have divergent beliefs. My wife is a very much a fundamentalist believer, and so you do have kids going to church on Sundays, and so you do have to give kids the alternatives. And I love even little things like letting them watch Cosmos with Neil deGrasse Tyson, and just the idea that there is science that's right there, and there's alternatives. And I've also likened it a lot to like how just the idea of like your if your head had a little invisible bubble around it. And I've said, how there's beliefs versus worldview. Beliefs are just what you say, but worldview is what you actually, at the deepest level, truly believe. And I've said, people are going to tell you their beliefs all the time, but I want you to imagine that you have a space bubble around your brain for your worldview. And I said, who gets to decide? And of course, they always know when I ask it this way that the answer is I do. But who gets to decide who tells you what you have to have as your worldview, what you have to truly believe? And of course, they know the answer is I get to decide that. I get to decide my worldview. And it's so cool to give kids that power. It really is. And there's they get it. I think even at a young age, we underestimate sometimes what they pick up on, but I think they get it that there's a lot at stake here in being sucked into a mythological worldview. And
Wow.
it's really it is a privilege. Well, can I ask again, going back to your story? When did you actually make a profession? Like, was there an altar call at your church,
Oh,
or
sure.
when did you actually say I'm in. I'm a believer.
Sure, sure. Of course, I was attending church before I was even born. In utero, I was attending church, and my dad was a military man, and we were, at the time, I was about 5 years old. We were attending First Baptist Dallas with W.A. Criswell as the pastor, which is a big name back in the 60s. And
Hmm.
the the kindergarten class, I guess that was probably where I was, took a tour of the baptismal, and they took us down. It was empty of water, and they took this little class of all these 5-year-olds in there, and we actually went down into the that little bucket baptismal pool, because there was room for all these little children, and they told us what it was about and what it was for, and when we were old enough, because we didn't want to burn in hell. And it was accompanied by all the scary stuff, that we would know that it was time to ask Jesus into our heart and whatever. And that was my moment. I mean, it was a moment. It was a moment in that empty baptismal pool with those other 5-year-olds. And I was like, I ain't going to hell. I'm not, I'm ready. I'm a bad child, and I want to not be a bad child. I was an overachieving child to begin with, and I was going to do what it took for approval. And I just knew I was going to do this. And so that was my moment of asking Jesus into my heart. I mean, I had all the pieces in place. I'm a sinner. I'm unworthy. I want to spend the rest of my life in heaven with God. The only way to do that is by accepting that Jesus died for my sins, the whole thing. And so that was my profession of faith. And it has I have a profound memory of it, because it was so very real to me as
Hmm.
in the perspective of a 5-year-old.
It's interesting how, like, at that age, it's presented in a way that there's really no other outcome. It's kind of like if you were to just take it to another ridiculous extreme, if you were to say, little Johnny, would you like to spend the day in the dark, damp basement, or would you like to go to the candy store? It's like, well, there's no choice.
Well,
Um,
and in an adult level to look at it, I always laugh, and it never occurred to me as a believer until after I discarded the religion. If you are under threat of eternal punishment, it is not free will, because we throw that expression around all the time. Free will. Oh, God lets you choose, whatever. If you're under threat of eternal punishment, it's not free will. You're being extorted. Of course, you're going to choose this thing. And anyway, it's so funny that
yeah.
as a as a smart college educated adult, that I didn't push back against that. I said it too. It's free will, your choice. You don't have to believe. Sure, you don't have to believe. You just want your skin flayed off of your body repeatedly. Ridiculous.
Have you ever seen Dan Barker's video? You don't have to go down in my basement.
Come on in. Come on in. Come see my son. He wants to talk to you.
That was fantastic. For anyone who hasn't seen that, I'll put a link beneath our video for that.
That's fabulous.
He's great. I was going to say too, just based on what you're piggybacking on what you're saying, it's amazing too that with the cognitive dissonance that we all had when we were in it, one of the biggest things that I'm realizing now that really should have hit but never did, and I say anytime I think that, I think, come on, you're better than this. You should have thought through this. But the Bible says over and over that God wants you to forgive. How should I forgive? 7 times? No, 70 times seven. It says, if you don't forgive, I will not forgive you. So forgiveness is hypercritical to God, so to speak. And yet, in the biggest economy of all time, so to speak, with the salvation message, God says, you have this little teeny snippet of time compared to eternity. You have this little teeny snippet of time in which, if you don't confess me as Lord, I will never forgive you again. I will be the most unforgiving, unrelenting person you could imagine. I'll be the most
Wow.
worst psycho. I'm like, well, isn't the Christian message forgiveness? Well, yeah, but your main guy, the Yahweh character, is the most unforgiving person ever. And honestly, I never thought about that before until
Profound.
it's like this is the most unforgiving message you could think of. And when you mix it with the eternal conscious torment, which I know some Christians tend to rewrite now as well. It's God's gonna just love everybody in the end, or it's like a purgatory or an annihilation. But like if you really preach a hellfire, you're talking about a truly not just unforgiving, but a psychotic psycho God.
Sadistic. Yes.
Yeah.
Agreed. That's profound. That and it's reflecting on it. Why didn't this occur to us early, and create in us an absolute resistance? I will not conform to this. I will not. This is immoral. It's beyond immoral. As you said, it's psychopath.
Yeah. And it's amazing too the way that we would all, and I again myself included here, um, we would just kind of forget about the people that already went before us, so to speak, that didn't believe. Like, we just went to church and we sang our songs, and now let's go to the steakhouse to get a nice Sunday lunch together as a family. And Uncle Joe died last year as a pagan, and as
Mm.
we're sitting there eating our steak and potatoes, he's frying, and we're just enjoying life. Or if you were to think about like your story, where your kids left before you did, to think that you would, I would imagine, have had the thought of, if they die right now before they can reconfess Christ as Lord, then I'm going to have to go to heaven without them. And the whole question of, could I actually enjoy being in heaven, knowing that I can know and maybe even see, according to like the whole parable that, Abraham's bosom, so to speak, I can
Sure.
maybe even see them in hell burning. And I could look up at my Savior and say, you could take them out right now. Please take them out. And he would say, no, never, ever, ever.
And
And
then I'm supposed to continue to be joyful. Right. It doesn't make, it's so irrational.
yeah. Well, with that whole background, I wanted to ask too, did you ever get to a point as maybe a teenager where you recommitted your life, where
Oh,
some of us
sure.
got like super serious? What did that look like?
Periodically, repeatedly, because, and it was all out of, so when you hit those teenager years and the hormones kick in and you start thinking bad things, or you start doing bad things that are bad in the context of religion,
Yeah.
and you've got to come to terms with this primal urge that's just driving your thought and your behavior, with this intellectual piece where, if I do these bad things, and I mean, you can't articulate it, you don't know how to say that, you just know you're being bad. And so it's a joke in youth groups. Kids they go to youth retreats and they have this mountaintop experience, and I'm so bad and I did all these whole things and I rededicate my life to God year after year after year, because we can't override those primal, we certainly can't override those primal thoughts, and very few of us can override the primal urges to engage in this behavior. And so, just like every other poor kid in my youth group, I would do the youth, and I think that's why they send you on those youth retreats, is to get you to feel bad about it and heap on the guilt and shame, and keep you towing the line. And so, yeah, I did. In college, I was a summer missionary in Southern Baptist circles. We have these summer missions programs where you spend the summers in your college years doing things. I was on a, believe it or not, I was on an evangelism team, a youth revival team of 4, 2 men and 2 women, college age, who did. I'm from Georgia, and so we did that whole area, going about 2 churches a week. We would be there 3 or 4 days at times, and this is back in the 70s. So we had puppets, and we had skits, and we had music, and we had kumbaya, and we would work with the youth group, and sometimes we would present for the whole church service. And we did this all summer, 2 churches a week for the summer, and of course, I considered being a missionary. That's what that's what women can do. Men think about the pastorate, and that was out of the question for me. But I did think about being a missionary. In fact, Southern Baptists also have something called the Journeyman Program, which is a 2-year program after college. And I got all the way to the point of applying. And of course, I wanted to go to Africa because that's the only place you can be a missionary. And so, and then a series of circumstances worked out that that didn't work out for me timing wise and different things. But yeah, it's if you're doing it right, it drives your everything. It drives what you're going to do with your career, who you're going to date, who you're going to marry, how you're going to live your life, all those kinds of things. So I absolutely was in the line with every other Christian young person as I went through. And then when I started teaching high school and college Sunday school, I tried to do that when my children were little. So I wasn't, they always want to put you in the nursery when your kids are little. And it's like, oh, hell no, I need some space. And so when my children were little, I would try to teach high school and college Sunday school. And we spent so much time and effort and energy trying to determine what God's will is. And I could see it replicated in these young people in those Sunday school classes, their earnest, genuine effort to determine God's will. It's a mystery, it's a secret. You got to pray about it. And then your Bible will fall open to a passage and you read it. And oh, now I know I'm supposed to be a preacher or a pastor or a missionary. I've heard God's still small voice. And it's just, I look back on the futility of that and the waste of time. It's, I think it probably factors in, whether consciously or subconsciously, in the work that I do with recovering from religion, is trying to unwind a little bit of that work, because I spent so many years making proclamations of things that I couldn't possibly know are true, saying that they were true, trying to guide people in this, to do the same thing, to live their lives this way. And so I again, we've chased a rabbit here, but I think it inspires what I do. I don't know that I'll ever reach the point where I'll say, okay, I'm done. I've undone, 40 years of that by, that maybe I've got to go 40 years doing the good part to unwind all that. But yeah.
I hear you. I'm in a similar boat. I feel like I often tell people that if I don't know, put in 1,000 people into the kingdom, I want to take 100,000 back out.
Right. I mean, it's a ledger. I mean, in your mind, it's almost whether it's literal or not. It's just you're trying to do good, and I guess back then you were trying to do good. I guess it's just a perspective of how you learn what good is and what it means to be a good human person, and what it means to help people. And for some of us, when we make that transition, I use the word seismic because for me, everything changed. Everything I valued, everything about how I wanted to live my life, everything I believed, everything changed. And so anyway, your original question was, did I rededicate myself? Yes, repeatedly, often.
You touched on a subject I wanted to ask about, and that's the idea of depravity. You didn't use that word, I think, but just the idea of you're worthless, you're bad, you're doing bad things. When you bring in the teaching of original sin, where you're kind of born in sin, but then you're obviously adding to it, you're rebelling against God, and you're also failing to do things that He wanted you to do. You're really messing up over and over, and that's the point of it. You need Christ for the overall big picture of salvation. He needs to cover you with His righteousness, but then you need that the gospel to be applied through the Spirit to you daily to live out what it means to be a godly person, have Christ in you, which is your hope of glory. And then you end up in this conundrum, though, for a lot of us did, and I want to ask you if you felt this way too, of you kind of feel like you're always a failure in sorts, even if you're personally like very optimistic and positive and very confident. This sense of like, if there's any level on which I could say I'm not experiencing the joy of the Lord, I'm not witnessing enough, I had a bad attitude, I didn't do enough devotions, I didn't really want to spend more than a minute praying, God, please help me to have a good day today, like that's not passionate for God. Where's the hour in the Word? Where's the praying drops of blood, so to speak, for the lost of the world and for the people around you that don't know Christ? And you just get this sense of I'm not on fire enough. And certainly some people's personalities and backgrounds lend them to be more on fire more often, so they kind of avoid that. And I think I avoided some of that. But I was that kind of person where if you said, let's read, a chapter of the Bible, I'd go read 3 books of the Bible. But, you still end up anywhere on that spectrum, you end up with this sense of like, if there's anything other than true joy of the Lord happening, the problem can't be God. Clearly, he's perfect, and he's just waiting for me to make good choices. The issue is me. And so you just have this sense of, even if I'm declared righteous, justified in his sight for eternity, I'm still this bad person that's just making so many mistakes. And you end up with almost like a psychological issue, I think, for some people, where it's just like, I just feel like I can't win. I can't win with this God thing. And I know a lot of people that I've seen in the different, Facebook groups and so forth that you get into, people say this was just like, it was supposed to be a yoke that was easy and a burden that was light. And it was never like that. And did you feel like that in any sense with any issues as you're growing up, whether it was just your walk with Christ or sexuality or anything else that became an issue that kind of kept you from
Sure, sure.
thriving?
And I think what happens is you can do all of the mechanical things. You can read your Bible, you can spend time in prayer, you can attend church, you can be a leader. You can do all the things as a Southern Baptist, or maybe it was just my particular region and the churches that I went to. All of those are sort of a given. Yeah, everybody's got to do those. But the ultimate goal is, how many people have you brought to the Lord? How many people have you witnessed to? They would let you off the hook if the person didn't accept it, because pearls before swine, but you had to do your part, and your part was, I use a lot of profanity, and I'm trying to clean it up because
Go for
it
it.
just rolls right out. But um, you your job, this is to random strangers. I remember as a child sitting next to somebody. My dad was a commercial airline pilot, and we traveled by air quite a bit. And when you do past travel, you take whatever seat they'll give you. And I was often sat, but beside strangers. As a child, like 10 years old, I remember the anxiety. I knew I was going to witness to who I sat to. And of course, the question is, do you know Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior? I'm 8, 9, 10, and I remember even then the anxiety of it, but you still have to do it. You still have to do it. And you couple that with all the things that you're doing everything right. You're doing everything right. And you still are not good enough. You're still a failure. You cannot do enough for God because he's done so much for you. And because the list is so long of what you have to do to conform to doing the things that you're supposed to do. And again, I've said several times already in this interview that I didn't consciously put that together, but as I reflect on it now and thinking that was true, my whole life is always striving to do what was considered the right thing, and you're always trying, and you never meet it. You never hit that goal. You never say, oh my God, I did it. Today I did all of the things right, and I won this person to the Lord, and now I can take a breather. It was just a treadmill. It just never ended. You just could never do enough. So
Yeah.
yes, I have, yes, as you described it, I just found myself going, absolutely. And it's probably universal for a lot of us that were in
Yeah.
evangelical Christianity.
It's funny when you mentioned witnessing. Just this is more of a funny part of it, but I think that for some of us there was this sense of we could check off the box that we had witnessed if we just put a track in their hand. And so it was like the easy way out of like, if I
That
just,
counts. That
it
counts.
technically has the gospel in there. It has, the Romans road or Ephesians 2:8-9 and John 3:16. And like, technically you did give them something. And
Check mark.
the spirit can make them read it, especially the chick tracks. My dad was an avid, he's passed now, but he was an avid
Trick track.
like just track giver. We would go to the churches, Baptist kind of churches, and they'd always have the racks in the back, like, please take these with you and pass them out. And so we always had a stack of 100 of them in the car or something. And so we'd go to the local grocery store, and I remember, as much as in a sense as a Christian, you'd be like proud of him for sharing the gospel. You'd almost cringe because going with him to the supermarket was not about the groceries at all. The groceries were a side issue. This was a chance to give out, 20, 30, 40 tracks, and he would do it. I mean, it would be very rare for us to go to the grocery store and for him not to empty his pocket of those tracks. And I will admit, as a kid, I sometimes cringed a little bit about some of those conversations. And there were times when you'd occasionally get that hook where somebody would say, "Oh, what's this? What's it about?" And the grocery shopping would stop, and we'd stand there for 20 minutes while he gave the gospel. And over and over, I remember those memories. But
Wow.
I was curious
Wow.
with you mentioned, being a teenager and all that. Did did the whole purity culture, shame culture, did that come into play much in terms of your, or even modesty culture, come into your story much?
Yes, but it was more prevalent, or I paid more attention to it. I was a child of the 70s. I was a teenager in the 70s, and certainly that was a piece of it. But the whole true love waits and all of that was more my children's generation. So my children faced more of it than I remember facing. I don't even think we talked about it back then. It was expected that you would not be sexually active and that you would remain a virgin. It wasn't. We didn't make a true love waits out of it. It was just that was the standard. But when my children were teenagers, oh, they had all of that, and they had what passed for sex education in Tennessee public school, which is a joke because it's evangelical, it's abstinence, abstinence only. It was just awful. So I lived it vicariously through the children more than I did the first time around as I was a teenager. But the children, when they tell their stories, and each of my children is a free thinking, progressive, active non-believer, and when they tell their story, that was a big piece of theirs because they, in their era, we did know a whole lot more about sexuality, and they did begin to understand this is not, they got it way early before I did. This is not evil. This is not bad. This is not even unhealthy if you do it properly. You got to be proactive about how you're going to manage this. So that was part of when they came to me with those questions, is we're not supposed to do this whole sex piece at all ever, and until we're married. And even then it's going to be within pretty, narrow versions of this. And so that all factored in with them, not as much on my own first go, but with children, it certainly did.
Hmm. I was just curious, as a side note, but related to sexuality, did you have any friends that you grew up seeing who had talked about or even were homosexual? And knowing the Southern Baptist stance on that, was that ever an issue where you were torn between, you need to repent of your homosexuality, friend of mine, versus just letting them be who they were? Did that become a part of any of your discussions with
Sure,
people?
sure. And as a child of the 70s, that was on the forefront. There were friends that I had in high school. It wasn't I don't remember, again, just like the purity culture, I don't remember sermons about it. Because we didn't talk about it at all. It wasn't that it was preached against. You just didn't, you don't even breathe the words. We don't talk about homosexuality. And I remember in high school and college having friends. And of course, back then it was a little bit before, it was still a very risky time for people who were gay and lesbian, to voice who they were, to come out who they were. So yes, we knew that the religion was against that, and I had turmoil over it because it was like they're not bad people, and they're not even doing bad things except for the rules in the book says maybe no, but they weren't being bad people or doing bad things. So again, it came home more to me when the children were in high school and they were starting to have friends that were not, binary, or that were just not going to be heteronormative. And so that's when I started processing more. That's that whole journey for us happened when what I should have done as a teenager, I did it more when my children were teenagers, because it was just the nature of how my narrative goes. But yeah, and so yeah, we had to deal with that. They had to deal with it. That was part of the package of questions they came to me with, to say, and here's another thing, is this a bad thing? Is this as bad as it is all that? You can't be gay, you can't be lesbian, you can't be a Christian if you're those things. So yeah, it's all part of it.
Hmm. What were you taught about the end times? Did that get? I assume as a Southern Baptist, you knew the rapture was coming, and you better be ready.
Oh my gosh! And I had an album about those. I can't remember who it was, and it was a whole album, song after song, both sides of the end times and how it was going to. There was one song on there, "I wish we'd all been ready," and it's this whole narrative about there are two people walking down the street, and I wish we'd all been ready, and it's too late, and it's agony, and yeah, I mean, there was no question, and like every generation for the last 100 years, it's going to be right around the corner. Jesus is coming. It's going to happen. And you would wait for it. And as a kid, you would look for signs of it. And if there was ever weird weather or some bizarre thing that happened, and it was, it's the end times. It's the end times. And so, yeah, it was so baked into the whole storyline that this was coming and that it was going to be a horrible time. And are you pre-millennial or post-millennial or millennial? And it's like, it was so ubiquitous. You didn't think outside of that. It was just that was what was going to happen. It was just which version of that is going to happen.
Yeah, it's interesting how some of them got away with actually trying to put some dates on it. And are you familiar with the name Harold Camping?
Oh yeah, the guy, yeah,
Yeah,
with the how many
he.
times has he predicted it?
Yeah, I think. I mean, I know he's passed now, but I think he predicted it at least three different times, maybe more. But I remember we grew up listening not as much to him, but for anyone who doesn't know what I'm talking about, there's a group out in California called Family Radio, and I think they were much more normal in terms of a lot of different churches would have said this is a good group, and they just would play hymns all day and read scripture. But one of the main leaders, I think some of the other leaders just kind of left the business or passed away. So this one man named Harold Camping kind of took charge, and so people couldn't really shut him down because he ran the place. And he uh, he would have these call-in shows, and he talked to people for hours, sometimes just answering questions. And as he got into this, he began to talk about his own studies, which included figuring out the Bible's like hidden messages. And he wrote books about it, I'm sure too. But the last time he did it, he was like, I have absolutely no doubt about it. I have figured out what I got wrong the first two times. I know where, and God has helped me to, hone my skills at interpreting the Bible. I'm sure, and I'm telling you, this is the last time. I won't ever set a date again because I won't have to. This is it. And people sold their homes
Oh
and
yeah.
everything so they could afford to buy these big billboards, repent. And of course, the day came and passed. I think, I don't know when it was, but many years ago. And boy, it just, I remember thinking at the time, I mean, I was still a Christian when that happened, but I remember thinking, this makes us look really stupid. And it should have made me feel a lot more stupid than it did, but I just thought this makes us look really stupid to the
Right.
world. And is this the best we've got? These are the men of God who study scripture all day. They're doing this to the truth. And
Hmm.
I interview a lot of people, as you know, and I do come across some people that literally were in what they would have probably said is like a version of a terrorized sense from these messages, because they would wonder, like, if for example they got out of bed at night and they went to their parents' room and their parents weren't in bed, if the parents happened to be in the garage, getting something, that they were like, maybe I got left behind. And it really does put you in that frame of mind of you. I mean, it's part of the whole hell thing. You need to be afraid of the fear of the Lord. It's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God, and God will, you if you don't do this, meaning you don't repent and turn to Jesus and turn to the cross, you will regret it, and you'll regret it deeply. And that's the whole point. Is like, yes, but there's good news. That's the bad news. But now let me give you the
Right.
good news. But people get put into a spot where if they even have a doubt, like, I know there's the whole once saved always saved thing, but people sometimes do make legitimate professions of faith where they think, I think I believe in Jesus. I'm, pretty sure I do. I know he died for me. I know he rose again, and I know his blood was shed. And I know that God said if I believe that, and that it was for me, in my place, in my stead, that I'm covered by the blood, that I'm right with God now forever. But they sometimes think, well, sometimes I don't feel on fire for God, or sometimes I'd rather watch a TV show than read the word. Is that evidence that the Spirit's not in me? Because there is the fruit of the Spirit, and if I don't have it, maybe I'm not actually saved. I mean, the tree bears fruit, and if I don't have fruit, then maybe I'm not grafted into that tree. And so people do begin to be afraid, and then so you add into the stuff the rapture and hell, and boy, people just get into a tailspin. And another aspect I would just throw in real quick and pass the ball back to you, but the whole idea of the demons. I don't know if you got exposed to like Frank Peretti and this whole idea of there's angels and demons kind of fighting
The spiritual
the
realm.
spirit world, and you think I could be left behind, especially if I'm not truly a believer, meaning I could be going to hell, or I could certainly face the tribulation and the horrors of that. And in addition to that, even if I'm technically saved, hopefully, that even within that, there's this terrifying realm all around me. And when I'm in church listening to the preacher, and for some reason I don't really want to listen and focus to what he's saying, that's probably a demon trying to get me. Did you deal with some
Wow.
of those fears at all as you were going through
Oh
it?
yeah. Oh yeah. And I remember when a specific conversation I had with my second son where he was expressing his doubts about all of the whole religious package. And I said, Sam, you can, just because you deny it, just because you say that you don't believe it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And while you may not believe this, there is an entire spiritual realm. Like, I knew what I was talking about. There's this entire spiritual realm that is around you. So you're denying it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I don't know why that memory is so vivid to me about having that conversation with him. I was trying to get him to stay religious, as the children were going through their process. And I just remember that was a talking point for me to try to get to impress upon him how dangerous the spiritual world was. And he just called me out, and he was like, Mom, what do you mean? What do you mean? And we had a conversation that led us both, as we talked it through together, as we struggled through it together, we got into the point of, okay, if it's spiritual, it transcends our bodies. And we talked about death and how we don't survive our death. Our everything about us is in our brain and our body. And when our brain dies, our memories, our personality doesn't exist outside of our body. And it was such a simple concept. And yet at the end of the conversation, that was the conclusion that we came to. And so it's another one of those things where I look back and I'm like, how did it take me so many years to just put that's a pretty straightforward. There's no evidence that we survive our death. There's no evidence at all that we survive our death in any way, much less all this other spiritual whatever that's going on or that's supposedly going on around us. There's no evidence for that. And all science and reason points us to the fact that it doesn't, that there is no. And so it's so funny how it was so looming and so big on the other side. So and then you do the transition and you do the heavy lifting and you do the work to discard it and take it apart. And then on the side, it's like, oh my God, I was so stupid. I was so dumb. How did I ever believe that? There's no evidence for it. It's so straightforward. Anyway,
Hmm.
it's all just like every other piece. When you get on this side of it and you look back with the clarity of reason and science and logic and all those things, that it's it's multiple things, and embarrassing is the least of it. But you're just mortified that an educated person such as yourself would have fallen for that and wouldn't have seen through that and wouldn't have done more work to dissect it and to take it apart and to analyze it.
Hmm. That's a good segue to a question I had about the whole idea of science and evolution and all that. Did you, I assume, as a good Southern Baptist, evolution was obviously one of the ploys of the devil. You certainly didn't have anything to do with any monkeys. But, you know, as you're going through all that, you obviously have this conundrum of, okay, well, science is saying, the Earth is very old and the universe, and, we're saying no, it's more like 6 to 10,000 years max. Um, that's quite a discrepancy of issues, and certainly I think a lot more science has obviously come out since some of those discussions were at the very beginning, where the church kind of bashed itself and said, we're not budging on this. Evolution has nothing to do with reality. So much science has come out, I think, in the last few decades. But how did you deal with that with your kids? Like did they bring up questions specifically about science and
Absolutely.
even
And
issues?
that's actually part of my narrative. I kind of dropped a hint earlier in our conversation that simultaneous, parallel to the journey I was making with my children and their questions when they were young teenagers, I was making a physical journey myself. So because I'm, Southern Baptist, I did all the Southern Baptist things when the children were little and we were doing church. The one thing that we get to do as religious people that we get to do pretty freely is overeat and overindulge, because That sin is, it's sort of, we can't have all the sex we want. We can't have all the debauchery and the alcohol and all that stuff. But the food in the religion, oh my God. And as a Southern Baptist, the covered dish meals and the women's retreats, it was food, food, food. So I approached my 40th birthday about the time my children were going to be teenagers. I was overweight and out of shape, and the usual hot mess, the whole thing. And as I was reaching 40 and kind of reflecting back, I thought, the first 40 years of your life, and I had all those children so quick together too. So I had not taken very good care of my body. But my thought was the first 40 years of your life, you can treat your body almost how you want to, and it'll show up for you. The second 40, you kind of got to give back a little bit. And this was all in the context of religion. And so, because I was still a very religious person. So I thought, okay, I'm going to make this commitment to get in shape. I need to lose weight. I need to be able to be around for my kids. It's all about the kids. And so because I'm kind of an analytical person, I didn't want to go read another diet book. I had read diet books. I'd read exercise books. I kind of wanted to have an understanding of the science. Prior to that, my feelings about evolution were sort of ambivalent. I did not think I was not a young Earth creationist. I really didn't think that. I really thought probably that's, and the language that people like me would use is, well, the story in the Bible is poetic. Genesis is poetic. It's not literal, whatever. And so I was able to kind of get away with that because I didn't have to deal with it. It didn't matter to me. I don't care. It probably wasn't young Earth creationist. Maybe it was. Maybe it's not evolution. Doesn't matter. I don't care. So I began my journey of wanting to know the science, starting with simple. I didn't have a science background. I was an English major in college, so I didn't even have college level science classes to draw. And so I thought I'm going to study a little bit about human anatomy, physiology, movement, how our bodies work, that kind of thing. And as I started to research that and started to understand, what food, how our bodies process nutrients and this and that, everything kept going back to this evolutionary heritage that we have as human beings, and what the ideal foods were. What would our ancestors have eaten in order to thrive? And so, it was certainly chasing a rabbit as far as finding my way to evolution, but that was happening about the time that the children were asking me these questions. And so I was having this simultaneous awakening of, if this is true, and if we are a product of evolution, then that does mean that the Bible is wrong about some things, because it started to occur to me the fall of Adam, the fall of man, was the linchpin. That's the point of the story. He has to have failed. He has to have had the fall of man in order for all the other Jesus parts to fit in there. And so that was creeping in about the time the children were asking me those questions. So I was having this secondary experience of figuring out this religion piece is in conflict with what I'm seeing is the reality of what science is, and what we know about humanity and human nature and the physical piece of being a human. So it all came together in the end, because as I made the journey, oh my gosh, Tim, I remember the pieces falling into place. It was like, there's going to be a lot that we're not going to understand. And I was okay with that. But having the pieces fall into place, understanding that, okay, if we can see religion as this thing, this man-made thing, all these other things make a whole lot more sense. The history of the world and the history of human behavior and evolution and physics and everything makes sense if you say, well, this is what religion is, and you put it in its bucket and you put it over here. And so that was paralleling that other journey. So it was a big part of my process.
That's awesome. I would have liked to have said it was part of mine. I wish it were. It wasn't, but it was very helpful at the very end for me, in the sense of asking the question, well, just because Yahweh isn't real, and I can share more of my story if we get to it, but once I realized, just because the Yahweh character is not real and Jesus isn't real, that doesn't necessarily have to firmly imply there's no way there's an afterlife. And one of the things that came to my attention pretty quickly was this idea of, well, if Christianity is not true, which at a certain point, about 2 years ago exactly, I was very convinced it's no longer true, then maybe evolution has some really good parts to what it's saying, which I'd never admitted before. But you come up with this question of, okay, well, if evolution is true, that we have a common ancestor and we've evolved, then if I'm saying or making the claim I have some afterlife to look forward to, my body doesn't just become the energy of dirt and dust, it actually becomes like some kind of cosmic special conscious energy. If I'm going to make that claim, or at least that hope, then what's to say that the ancestors before me didn't have that hope? In other words, did the Neanderthals go to heaven too, or some kind of afterlife? Well, what about the iteration before them? What about 10 iterations before them?
Where's the line?
Yeah. What about if we go back to something that was just a four-legged creature walking on the ground? Do they go to heaven? And of course, all jokes aside about all dogs going to heaven, but it's like, if I'm not the pinnacle of creation, if I'm not made in God's image, if I'm just one of a huge string of evolutions that have occurred, I can't suddenly say I'm going to pick this one iteration of humanity, of this family tree, and
See,
this one iteration gets all these blessings of, we're made in the image of God, we get an afterlife, our energy is so special, but everything else before me isn't special at all. Like, there's no reason to make that conclusion. And
wow.
it helped me to remove the issue of the afterlife, which was, it's a different story, but it was a bit of a jolt to the system to realize it's probably not there. But it did help me to make some conclusions, which I hope that's a logical conclusion.
That's we'll talk about recovering from religion, but that's one of the last pieces to fall for a lot of folks, is the afterlife piece. And um it's both sides of it. It's both not wanting to let go of the idea of heaven and seeing our loved ones and getting to have another turn and extending ourselves, but the fear of the hell piece of it. And so people can logic themselves out of a whole bunch of it, the morality of God, a bunch of it, historical, accuracy of Jesus. There's a lot that people can reason out of academically, but the emotional release of the afterlife is one of the is consistently one of the last things that folks want to let go of, because we want to. And I say, had we been brought up without the idea of an afterlife, death would be so much more natural, be part of life. But because we got this whole Disneyland story, when you compare that to nothing, yeah, it sucks. When you compare, but the only reason it sucks is because you're trying to compare it to this big old party that we're all going to miss now. And so I part of my work as a humanist is to help my children, even now, for us to see, and it kind of factors into what I do with my estate planning. We're going to die. You're going to die, and I'm going to die, and what we've done in this life is going to be what's left to us. And so, how do we prepare for that better? How can we talk about it with more positive language? How can we prepare our loved ones for it, up to and including the temporal stuff, your property and your belongings and all that, but also your legacy? What message do you want to leave? Not only, for your children and then maybe their children, then maybe one more generation after that, and then it's all, then party's over because you're kind of done by then. Everybody that ever remembered you is gone, and whatever. It's the nature of it. And if we were able to talk about that in a more healthy way, I think we would do better. I think we would be better people. I think we would grasp our opportunity here on earth in so much more of a healthy way and a productive way, and an appreciation for, this is our moment and our window will close. And so anyway, yeah.
It's a good point.
Mhm.
What you said reminds me of something I brought up many interviews ago with somebody else. But you remember, when you're in the church, of course, one of the things that they're fighting against constantly is sin, and trying to get you to be more committed to, removing sin in your life and being more committed to Jesus. And of course, for men, the big issue is always their eyes and the lust. And one of the messages that came with that, and this relates to the afterlife discussion, is the idea of one of the worst deceptions that Satan gives you in terms of lust is and related to, pornography. The idea of, you're in a dream world. If you're watching some kind of pornographic movie, or in your imagination you're thinking of something, and of course, from a man's perspective, every woman is always perfect. She's whatever, dimensions you want, and she's always up for it. And it's just, you're in this fantasy world, and the concern from a Christian perspective, besides just this is, disrespecting God, is also you need to understand God has created this wonderful, wife for you, and she's gonna have stretch marks. She's gonna not be perfect. So don't do it just because, not just only because of you want to honor God, but also you are taking away from the beautiful reality, which is not going to look perfect. It's not going to look like some glamour model all the time, and men for women, you're not going to look like some kind of model GQ guy for your wife, but that's the beauty of life, is to embrace the reality of it and stop, get your eyes off of this stupid fantasy, because you're messing up what's actually in front of you. And in a similar sense, it feels like this afterlife kind of discussion is similar, where everyone's fantasizing, I want to be so free of sickness, which is obviously, we all want that. We want to be free of tears. We want wars to end. We want everyone to be happy. Who wouldn't want that? But it's still the fantasy side of it keeps you from actually enjoying your real life. And
Wow.
one of the hardest parts for me is looking at people that are still in the what I call the Bible prison, is realizing some of them will never live a day of their life. Like, to compare it to the Matrix, like, you will be stuck in a pod until the day you die. You will never escape
Never
the
free of
Matrix.
it.
And I don't know if that helps anyone to picture it, but heaven's a great story. It's a great fantasy, but it is just a fantasy.
And I think
And
it's just, and it is destructive. And I had never heard that comparison to the what we think of the destruction of the perfection of sexuality and all of those pieces. But what an analogy to be able to do that. And I think it does. I think it detracts, at least the heaven side of it detracts from it. It's why, not to get too far afield in politics, but it's why I think the evangelical Christian movement is so cavalier about what they're doing now. It doesn't matter. None of this matters. It's so temporal. It's so passing. That doesn't. This is not where the importance is. And those of us that are on the other side are just like, it's everything. It's the only thing, and we're destroying the planet, and we're not treating people fairly, and we don't have a just society. All of these things matter, and that's has become an ever widening gap with us and evangelical Christianity.
yeah, and that relates to, I think, to the climate change issue. I remember I used to listen to Pastor John MacArthur out in California avidly. I mean, I was an avid John MacArthur fan. Listened to many of his sermons dozens upon dozens of times, just because they were so, good, quote unquote. But I remember a sermon where he talked about the idea of how Christians should see climate change and taking care of the earth. And he said, well, in a certain sense, this is still kind of God's garden. God made the Garden of Eden, and this is still kind of his garden. So we tend it, but keep in mind, it's all going to burn. So don't put too much emphasis on it. And the idea of, climate change is not your big concern. Your concern is the kingdom of God, like in the gospel, period. And looking at this side, it's like, no, that's fantasy, and climate change is a very big issue. And metaphorically screwing ourselves by doing this to our kids and our grandchildren. We're making their lives miserable
Oh yeah.
over mythology, over mythology.
Mm.
I wanted to ask. We touched on it a few times with church issues, but patriarchy and misogyny. Growing up, you're not going to be a pastor. Your best shot at that is a pastor's wife. You mentioned, being a missionary, or certainly like a really well-respected nurse is an option. But apart from that, the best calling is to just be a wife and a mother, and to raise little soldiers for Jesus. It's always men getting the message from God, always men doing the sacrifices. You do get a few rare exceptions, like the judge Deborah, certainly the Virgin Mary, but it's always the men pretty much in charge. And the Godhead at this point, even though with the Gnostics, the Holy Spirit was very feminine, very much the mother figure. But at this point, God is very masculine across the board. How did that come across to you growing up? And when you look at that too, when you see not just the very generic kind of esoteric theology side, but even the very specific nastinesses, like where it says if a man rapes a girl, in the field, and in some circumstances, he's allowed to just pay the daddy, 30 shekels of silver, and she becomes his wife, and she has to
Mhm.
stay forever.
Mhm.
The idea of you're ritually impure just by being who you are, over and over and over. So many issues where women are treated as prizes for the people. When you kill the moms and dads and kill the soldiers, kill the little boys, kill the babies, the young virgins are supposed to be the prizes. When you look at teaching that worldview to girls, letting them see that that's what the Yahweh character is all about. That he's not just allowing it, he's actually prescribing a lot of these things. What did you think through both when you were in it, and how do you see it now that you're on this side of it?
When I was in it, it was so fundamentally part of the narrative. It was another one of those things that fall in the category of you didn't question it. I didn't love it, but I just God. It's what we got. It's the way it is. There was, and if I ever did question it and push back, it was so resoundingly defeated by whatever Sunday school teacher I was asking. It was just, you can't, there are just some things that you're not going to be able to change. And this is one of the things. So having grown up in it, but again, when my children were asking their questions, one of my daughters was like, what if I want to be a preacher? I mean, she was a devout religious child. They did their Bible memory verses, and I was that mom. We had our little offering envelopes. I mean, we checked every box. And in her series of questions, each of the children had different questions, but her series of questions were, but what if I want to be a preacher? What if I feel like I can be a preacher? And the difference between, they may have told me that I couldn't do that, but you're not going to tell my daughter I'm not going to do that. So when she asked it, and I got my hackles raised, and I was like, that's a good question. Let's see what we can find out about that. It was just another one of those things that the indoctrination didn't go to the secondary level. In other words, it worked on me, but it's not working. It's not that it's not working on my kids. It's not working on me on behalf of my children. It was, and I hope, I'd like to say in my narrative that that's a reflection on this primal desire to protect and nurture your children overrides this other piece of it that we're grown up with. It was just not going to be okay. So, I think we see so much of the bad result of the patriarchy and of this whole sexuality piece in recovering from religion. We have folks come to us from all points of the spectrum, all kinds of religions and all kinds of journeys away from and questioning through religion. But that's that underlying current is present everywhere for the men and for the women. It does. The founder and president of Recovering from Religions, Dr. Dale Ray, is a psychologist, and he also is an author. He wrote Sex and God. He wrote The God Virus first, which is an outstanding book, but Sex and God really brings it all home. And we see it's the negative sexual religious teachings are so prevalent, and they're across the board, and they cause damage. No matter how much you think you've risen above it, they have drilled holes in your brain where you store some things that you don't even know are there, because it's the unique protective armor of religion that they do that. And whether it was intentional, or they were the founders of formal religion could see the power of that, or if they simply could see the result, and so they hammered those things even more. The control of our sexuality is such a huge big piece of it, and we see it all of the time in religion. So on a personal level, yes, it affected me. It most certainly affected me more when my children were affected by it, and I see it all the time in the folks that reach out to Recovering from Religion.
One of the verses that always sticks out to me, I can't quite quote it perfectly anymore, but the one about women need to stay silent in the churches, and ask your husbands when you get home
Timothy,
if you have a
I
question.
think. Yeah.
It's amazing. Part of the issue to me as well is just we're kind of touching on it with a lot of these topics, but the idea of this, the brainwashing and the blindness that occurs, where you could literally look at some of these topics and think, this is so mean to girls. This is so incredibly mean. And just to step back from a second from some of the specifics, I remember you mentioned Adam earlier, and the Adam and Eve story. Adam there's two different versions, as we know, of the creation story that emerged together in Genesis. But one of them says that God was looking for a partner for Adam amongst the animals, and it was like, well, he can't find anybody so I guess we'll have to make girls, like, as an afterthought. And then instead of God, who made Adam from the dirt, instead of making her from the dirt as well, he makes her from a rib of his, like, you're kind of coming from him. And then of course, she's the one that falls first for Satan's attacks, which it's a whole other issue. But
Convenient.
why Yahweh would allow this the enemy of their souls in the garden is another story. But he lets the enemy of their souls in the garden, and then she falls first. And I think again in one of the pastoral epistles, it talks about women shouldn't speak because she was in the transgression first. She was the first transgressor, and it's kind of like a punishment of like she got put in her place because she's the one that did this. There are alternative perspectives in other books like the book of Enoch that talk about this early time of the world, so to speak. And in the Enochian story, we know that they blame the ladies for the whole issue of the fallen angels coming down and procreating and creating these Nephilim, these giants. And the ladies were just so they were temptresses basically to these angels. They couldn't resist them, and the angels knew better, but they couldn't resist, so they went for the human women. And any way you look at the way they started this story, they keep on blaming the women, putting women down, making them an afterthought. And of course, you get, again, going back to men are always in charge. Men do the tabernacle, men do the temple, men do the sacrifices. Now men do the preaching, and it's like it's this constant message of women. Men are in power. Men are getting the message from God. Men are going to lead the church. Know your place. And I feel like both in terms of race issues but also gender issues, it's so cool that people are now getting their voice, to go back to the voice concept, and saying no, this you're number one, inheriting a heritage that is nasty, but if you want to choose to continue it, and you're going to tell me you've got a place, sit down and be quiet and listen to the preacher. The answer is absolutely not. I have a voice, and I will go a completely different direction. I will take the power. If you won't let me take it easily, I will take it, very much by force, where I will stand up and say, I have a voice. I am not an afterthought in the paradigm of this universe. And boy, it frustrates me to see Facebook groups that I'm still in from the early days, where you see some of these messages of submission to God and submission, the complementarianism. And when you look at women now, do you ever get the sense that some of them are, even the ones that are still in it, they're still in the brainwashing, where they're starting to say, yeah, some of this doesn't feel right. Like even the Southern Baptist thing, I'll mention this and let you respond. But the Southern Baptist Church is going through such a terrible time right now with, women speaking up and saying, I was abused. This was a horrible thing that happened to me, and they keep on burying these abuse cases. And it's all the men are always burying it and saying, no, we're not going to bring these cases up. Or do you think some of these things are helping women to say, there's some bigger issues here. This isn't just about.
I hope so. I think so. I think so. I think that organized religion stays behind the power curve. Things happen in society well before they ever reach religion, but religion does try to respond to it. Sometimes they do it poorly. As soon as we had the civil rights era in the 60s, and all the churches, the Mormon church and all the churches, it's, then it's okay. Years later, it's okay. We can be multiracial, whatever. They're so far behind the times. And I think they're way behind on this one. But I do think that they begin to get it. And so they do try to change some kind of church policy. It's weak, it's ineffective, and it's way, way too little too late. But I think that the leadership of religions, and my experience as Southern Baptist, is they're stuck because they see the cultural edge, and they want us to, they're trying to keep us stuck in the 50s, and it is just not going to happen. So they've got to do something, and so they offer a token thing. "Oh, we're a Me Too friendly church." Okay, thanks, because it's such a tiny little increment in everything that needs to be addressed. But I do think that they outwardly try to do that because I think they see the writing on the wall. They're in a hot mess. I mean, you look at young people, you look at the trajectory of the nuns, NONES, and you see how our certainly it's hard to look at our country right now and not recognize what a stronghold evangelical Christianity. They're the ones that got us in the mess with politics as they are with the virus. I mean, they're leading the way. They're carrying the banners, and I mean that literally too with our January 6th. But they're dying. They're just not going to survive in this world of information and technology and science and education and all the things that they're just not. So they're having to, they're having, they're not doing very well with their reflective moment. I don't know. I wouldn't begin to advise them because I think it's a negative anyway. So I don't care if they gasp their last. But if I were trying to offer them advice, I don't even know what I would say to them because they're stuck. They're stuck with this book that's inconsistent and outdated and all the things that in multiple religions are. Whatever the book of choice is, whatever fill in the blank book is, they're in a mess because it's not, you know, that's what we're saying on this side of it. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. It's not reasonable. It doesn't fit in with science. You are appealing to the most basest part of humanity, and good luck with that. And it's working to a degree, but ultimately, it just can't. It just can't survive. So I don't know. It's a little philosophical waning on my part, but that's kind of my perspective of it. I don't know. That's a good question on whether or not is religion responding to these things? Are they making any progress with them? Superficially, maybe. Fundamentally, probably not.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of the whole pain of someone doing a detox cold turkey. It's like, you're this bad stuff has to die, and if you're going to really do it this way with no help, it's going to be a painful process. And
it's true for both. So let's take Christianity for example. For both sides of it, both on the progressive Christianity side and on the fundamentalist Christianity side, both of them have to come to terms with the book is so inconsistent and so is such a hot mess of information, terrible history, terrible science, all of that. But it's all over the place. So the progressive side has to deal with this horrible stuff that's in there. The fundamentalist side has to deal with Jesus's love and all of the love your neighbor as yourself and whatever. There's no fixing that. The book's not going to change. What we come to terms with it, what are you going to do with it? And so their option of choice is to bury their heads in the sand and just not deal with it. Or they have they placate with some statement about, oh, well, that's the Old Testament. This is the New Testament, or whatever it is they say. I don't even know what, I can't even make their argument for them. As a lawyer, I'm supposed to be able to make their argument for them, but I can't, but they do have to come to terms with the fact that the book's all over the place. They've chosen this piece of it, but you got this whole mess for the rest of it. So.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned the racial thing. When I was at Bob Jones, we weren't allowed to have any interracial dating. And I remember after I left, heard this story where one of the Bushes, I think the older Bush maybe, but one of the Bushes went to Bob Jones to, on the campaign trail to speak. And after he finished his speech there, the news, of course, picked up, he was just at Bob Jones University, and Bob Jones has this whole anti-racial or racial thing where they won't let interracial dating happen. And I think within days or weeks, Bob Jones flipped on a switch. I mean, something they'd stood for decades.
Yep.
And the whole Ham, Sham, and Japheth thing.
Yeah.
God cursed black people, so you can't. And it's like all of a sudden, just because of George Bush, and we want to stand with him because he's a staunch Republican.
Yep.
We're going to change our dating policy. It's crazy. I was curious. I've got few last questions for you. The first one was just to finish up your specific part of your story, meaning the part of it where you deconverted. What were like the last few days or weeks? Like, what was it like? Was it very short? Was it like an hour where you deconverted? Was it a day, a week? Or some people even tell me, I don't even know when it happened. I just look back and say, at some point in the past year, I got out. I don't know, but I'm out now for sure. What were the last few days and weeks, years, whatever, months like? And then what was it like immediately after? Was it painful? Was it total joy? Like, how did that feel like?
That's such a good question. And I think I shared earlier, as my children began leaving high school and leaving home, they all went away to college. Well, they left home for college, 2 hours down the road, but still left home. And I'm left with this mess. I have a mess, and I continued to teach Sunday school, and I had made a determination. I was just going to keep going. I was going to pretend that kids could be free thinkers, and I would, enjoy watching them do that. And I didn't buy any of this stuff, but I was not going to pay the price. It was not going to fracture my marriage. I wasn't going to lose my community. I wasn't going to lose my church. I wasn't enjoying it. Like church had been a positive thing for me. It had been fulfilling. it had been, we were big dogs in the church, and it had been an ego trip, all the things that it was. And so I didn't want to walk away from it, and I didn't believe it. So that's when I said that I had a dark year. I had a really dark year because I would drag myself to church to teach Sunday school and prepare my lesson. And I also didn't want to go there in my Sunday school class. I wasn't ready to try to convince other people. I didn't mock what I was teaching. I didn't roll my eyes. I didn't try to come up with a spin on it to make it more. I just was robotic about it. This is what Sunday school book says. But that was my dark year. And as I said, I drank a lot, and I engaged in a little bit of destructive behavior. I was not, I was unfaithful in my marriage. There was a lot that I was trying to figure out what I was going to do. And so that was the bad year. But then when I finally had we call it a come to Jesus me, to come to Jesus moment with myself, to say, what's going to happen is going to happen. Whatever the fallout is what the fallout's going to be. I'm not living the next 40 years not like this. I'm not doing it. And so I told my husband, I told my family. It was terrible. Children were awesome. The children were overjoyed that but they knew it was going to be, kind of a what show. But for me, as hard as it was, and as hard as the divorce was, and as hard as my poor mother just cried and cried. My dad was critical and awful. My brothers rejected me. It was awful. It was awful. But in spite of that, personally, for myself, it was the Ingersoll quote about breaking the manacles, and the cell walls fell away, and I fearlessly, boldlessly faced all worlds. It was that moment for me, in spite of the pain, and in spite of the upheaval in my personal life, and in spite of the instability of what the hell now, what am I going to do now? What am I going to do with my life? How am I going to support myself? What am I going to do? It was so overriding the freedom, the space to be who I am, to draw upon all possible solutions to solve problems, to not be restricted to this narrow way, to be able to help people, to help my children, to understand them with a comprehensive array of how do we move forward with this. All of it was it was such a contrast, because I was coming from such a dark place in my bad times to such an open and light place.
Hmm. That's so cool. That's awesome.
Yeah.
I about 2 years ago almost, I was out at the end of September of 2019, and I was literally at this exact computer, this monitor, this desk, and it all came flooding in within an hour. I'd been investigating for about 18 months after doing some soul searching, you might call it, about issues of genocide and land theft and all that are clearly commanded in the Old Testament, but and especially with the idea of passing it on to children. But as I was going through my deep dives into just comparative mythology and all this stuff, right up until probably the last month or two, I would have said there's no way this is going to atheism. There's just no way. And I remember at the very end, maybe about a month, just guessing here, but about a month before I actually deconverted, I was listening to a Ricky Gervais interview, and I loved him in the UK Office. Have you seen that show?
Yes.
But I had no idea he was an atheist, and then I just how YouTube will pop up a suggestion, and I remember seeing, after I watched like a clip from The Office, the UK, a clip of him hosting the what's that award show? Anyway, he's hosting an award show, and at the end of it, like the last 30 seconds or something, he's saying, thanks everybody, it was a great show, good night, and he just said, I just want to thank God that I'm an atheist, or something like that. I'm like, wait, did he just say what I think he did? And as soon as he did, I was like, okay, he probably has some more videos about this topic out there. And so I began to search some of his stuff. And there was this one video where he's talking to somebody in some kind of castle or library or something. And they're not talking about deconversion per se, but they're just talking about a bunch of serious topics. And one of them is the Bible. And the interviewer says, what do you think about the Bible? And he says something along the lines of, well, it's obviously just a man-made book, like, period. And I remember thinking, I think I kind of agree with that. I think it's just a man-made book, period. like nothing else added. And it was maybe a month before I deconverted, but that, that terrifies you. You're like, what the hell did I just say to myself? But of course, at that point, you're like, there's got to be an answer. Where's the apologist? I need the good, I need William Lane Craig here to step in and get me over the finish line. What's the punchline? How do I get back to faith in Christ? And about a month later, I'm just sitting here on a Saturday morning listening to, interview or something, as you do, some information. And it wasn't any particular interview or video that got me. It was just me thinking about stuff. And it just felt like in the Matrix when Neo has escaped, but they want to teach him jujitsu, so they put him down
Put
in
the
the chair,
program in.
and they put the jack in his head, and he's like, "What am I do?" Like, "You're gonna learn jujitsu," and he hits the button, and within 10 seconds, he's like a jujitsu master. And of course, they wake him back up, and he's like, "Did you like it?" And he's like, "Yeah, do more." But that sense of like those 10 seconds where he's like, oh shit, a whole bunch of stuff just came flooding into my head. It was like that exactly for me.
Wow.
Like, I was talking to myself, so to speak, and I was saying, I don't think this has ever been real. And again, I don't have any voices in my head for anyone who wonders. It's just one voice, but you're having conversations because, I would have loved to have had conversations with other people or friends or loved ones. There was no one else to talk to about it that I knew of. And so I'm kind of thinking in my head, it's not real, is it? And it was like I was pushing myself saying, say the words, Tim, say it to yourself, admit it, it's not real. And the first thought that came to my mind at the moment was, is that even possible that this could not be real? Like, there's no way. Like, number one, there has to be a designer. There has to be a starting point. There has to be a prime mover, a first, someone that kicked the first domino off, and a reason there's something rather than nothing. But then I just thought, is it possible that humanity could have been deceived for 2,000 years? Is that even possible? And it was like, no, yeah,
Oh my gosh.
that feeling of, yeah, that I could see how that could have easily happened, actually. Especially when you think, taking it back to patriarchy, like if you got a bunch of men in power who said, this is the party line, you will believe it or
That's
you
what
will
it
die.
is.
You get that entrenched in everybody. 2,000 years later, if no one stood up to it, sure, I could see how it just kind of evolved and stayed around. And immediately it just, all the implications flooded. Wow, there's probably no God. Well, the gospel is irrelevant.
Oh, Tim,
It
what
just,
a story.
it was crazy because it was like an hour, and within an hour, I was fully deconverted. I mean, it wasn't like well, I need to do some more digging. It was like I did all my digging for 18 months
Prior.
and just resisted the final step. And I kind of described it as like, if you imagine a bunch of dominoes that, you know how you can stack them up and then you tip one and they all fall. Well, imagine that there is a set of dominoes called, deconversion, but you're a mile away when you're first asking your first questions. And so you're taking one little step at a time. And so you can kick all you want, but you're not going to hit the dominoes. You're too far away.
Yep. That's a good illustration.
And you get up right to it and you don't even know you don't realize you're right there, but you make that one little step and bam, it's gone. The house of cards falls, the dominoes are gone. And it was crazy. But the punchline I would say to add to it is just within that first hour, and for sure within the first day, I felt more peace than I had in 43 years as a Christian. Immediate peace. And you feel like you won the lottery because you're like, I could have gone to my deathbed thinking that this was
without
real.
figuring this out. Yeah. Isn't that bizarre that in the midst of the turmoil, in the midst of all of the external and all of the chaos of what's going to happen and everything I've believed and all that, you have this moment. You use the word peace. I use the word light and space and air. It's just, maybe not everybody experiences it like we did, but boy, I absolutely understand what you are describing when you say it that way. I talk about the puzzle pieces falling into place, and I sort of had a similar moment where I pretended, and I think I may have even seen this online somewhere. You take off your God glasses. In other words, let's look at the universe as if there's not one. Let's just say, for argument's sake, that religion's not true. You take off the God glasses and all of the things, the universe acts in a way that it would if there was no God. It's random and chaotic. And so that was a piece of my experimental acceptance of what eventually I embraced, which was, I am absolutely not confident that any kind of a spiritual being or any kind of a God exists. And yeah, wonderful.
Mm. One of the first things that we alluded to this before, so I won't make a big point of it, but the idea of feeling ridiculous afterwards, like I remember thinking, a God who likes to cut off the end of little boys' penises, a God who needs blood, a God who can't just say, I forgive you. Like I was like, this is ridiculous. A God who, we look at the big map of the world, and I'm sure you've seen that picture of like it goes around every once in a while, but the whole map of the world, and they draw this little teeny circle, like God speaks here. He's not speaking to
It's right
China,
there.
not talking to China. He's not talking to South America. He's not talking to Africa. He's not talking to Canada. He's talking to this little teeny circle of people there. And when and he's quiet for 400 years, and then he comes back, and where does he speak? Again to that little circle, and it's like, oh come on, this was crazy. And of course, then all the discrepancies that from an apologetics perspective you defended, you're like, what what was I
yeah.
thinking? Yeah.
When my family and I talk, when children and I get together, and of course we always talk about politics and current events, and the children are so gracious to me about the religion piece, because it's a regret I have having brought that. So I mentioned what I did earlier in the conversation about the joy that you must experience being able to raise children outside of that, all of the baggage. But when we have conversations, a couple of my children rejected belief in religion based on reason and science, and there's no evidence for this. It's kind of what I would call the science track or the reality track. One of my daughters, maybe both, rejected belief in religion because it was immoral. Their position was, I don't even care if it's true or not. I'm not going to research it. I don't need to know if it's true or not. It's immoral. It's a bad system. And I think we sometimes do a disservice to our believing brothers and sisters when those tracks blend, because we get ourselves, it's too distracting. Are we talking about whether or not there's evidence for it and it's not true for that reason, or are we talking about the morality of it? And when we bounce back and forth, clever Christians can use apologetics and sort of counter those, but it muddles the issue. And I think we need to be careful when we're talking to folks. Are we talking about evidence for it, or are we talking about the morality of it? Because they're two distinct reasons to reject the belief, both valid. And so, I one is not any better than the other or worse than the other. It's just how different people approach the whole thing. And those of us who have gone through the deconversion process, if ultimately we do both, we've rejected because there's no evidence for it, and the evidence points in the opposite direction. But we get to the point that you and I have gotten to, where you look at it and you see how utterly immoral this God being is, and how is described. The comment that you've made is how unforgiving. What kind of a parent, what kind of a creator would be that unforgiving of an imperfect creature that you've created? You've created them imperfect, and then you're going to be unforgiving. It's just no. Anyway,
Yeah, it's crazy.
Interesting
Yeah,
thought.
I love some of the memes that come around. Really do. I mean, memes aren't going to win arguments, but they do sometimes encapsulate it. But that God creates us imperfect, and he has this problem that he basically designed, and then to fix it, he's going to sacrifice himself to himself to fix it, and it's or blame us for it and send us to hell. It's just crazy. It is amazing. Well, I did want to ask. I've got just a few last things, and I want to kind of carve out a little time for the recovering from religion aspect of it. But I wanted to ask about the idea of kids. Marlene Winnell has a lot of videos, and one of them she talked about the idea of preying, like Prey, preying on kids.
Mhm.
And I think it was she who had painted this picture of the idea of, like, if you're in a church that allows icons, and which a lot of a lot of the different denominations do, where you see the literal picture or statue of Jesus up on the cross, you see the crown of thorns and the nails and the spear cut. He's bleeding, he's dying, and he's in terrible torturous pain. And you take a child who is naturally aware of how sad pain is. If they have a friend that they're riding bikes together and one of them falls and skins their knee, the other one runs to mom. I'm so sorry, this is terrible. I'll go run and get your mom. But kids are naturally very sensitive to pain and to wanting to help and to wanting to be a support to people. So you take a kid that has a soft heart, and then you put in front of them this picture of torture, and you say, he's there because of you. And if you were the only person, he would have still had to do this. And you put that on a kid from a young age, and especially in the context that we talk about of hell and heaven, the carrot and the stick. But even just the idea of, I'm going to pray on you. You have done such a bad thing that this man, look what you did. And then of course, as you become a teenager, you get this thing of every time you sin, you're pounding the nails in. You're like you're doing it again. You're crucifying him afresh. Could you talk about the whole idea of what how you respond to pictures like that, and just what it's doing to kids with indoctrination, but also potentially the psychological manipulation and abuse of children to teach them these things and to attack them with this idea of you're worthless and look what God had to do to make it right.
I think you did a beautiful job of describing that, Tim. You mentioned Marlene Winnell. She has coined the term religious trauma syndrome that we don't realize, even those of us who are very plugged into our children and their growth and their development, we don't realize how traumatizing an image like that can be. You did a beautiful job of explaining children have such a primal empathy, just it's what we want them to have. We want to teach them how it must feel to another person to be treated this way or to have this feeling. It's I think it's even part of our evolutionary heritage that we have this ability. It's why we thrive when we all do better, we all do better, as Wellstone said. But and to take a child and to take that trait of empathy and to manipulate it with that image, and it's such a visceral, ever-present, horrifying image. The crucifixion. We've become so callous to it because we've seen it, and those of us who've gotten through religion put it in context. But when you analyze it and you look at it with his broken body and the sorrow in his face and the imagery of the suffering and the pain and the blood and the sadness of his face and the additional layer of people that are grieving and can't help him, and then the soldiers who have done the deed and the whole thing, I think it's clearly traumatizing, and I think it sticks with us. You and I probably have remnants buried deep in those holes that I said religion drills into our brain and stuffs that crap in that later comes up because of that kind of imagery, that kind of suffering, that kind of and then not just to have that image, but it's your fault. You did it because of, and you do it every day. And if you were the only person, he still would have done this. And every time you do a bad thing, it's worse and it makes it worse and it does it again. How any of us are able to recover from that kind of thing, it's a wonder in itself. But I agree with you. I think it says it's religion knows what it's doing, and that image for anyone, but particularly for a child, and all of the pieces of it has proven so effective, because when we joke on this side of it, he sacrificed himself to save himself. It's silly, it's ridiculous, it's insane, and whatever. But to a defensive mind, to a small child's mind, to a defenseless mind, it has an impact. I think you did a good job of describing it.
And that word defenseless is a good way to wrap that up too. Is just they don't know better. You're teaching them a worldview in a context where they don't have any way to say, they don't have any power or any context to say, but what if this isn't correct?
Right.
What if there's some completely different way to see the world? And it amazes me too. Just as a side note, it's amazing as we talked earlier about witnessing. And when when you're out witnessing, you would go to different people and you'd kind of hope and pray that they would ask at least one question, which is, what if I'm wrong? And I remember even witnessing in terms of how we would prepare for it. We'd go through these witnessing classes at church, and they'd tell you different ways that you could, kind of hone your skills to converse with people. And one of the starting points, and this was more geared toward Catholics who would be probably tend to answer, well, I'm going to get saved because I'm a good person, my good works. But you would say, start with, if you were to die tonight, why would God let you into heaven? What would he say? Or what would you say to God if he asked you that question? And of course, hopefully they're going to say something like, well, I'm a good person. I don't cheat, I don't steal, this, that, and the other. And your answer needs to be immediately, if you were wrong about that answer, would you like to know about it? Meaning, can I give you the right answer? And we'd pray and hope in that context that everybody would be open, at least theoretically, to the idea of, I think I'm living the best life I can. I think I've got a good worldview. But if I'm wrong, I want to know about it, and I'm willing to adjust. I'm more committed to the truth than to my current worldview. We would ask everybody, if there was if you were witnessing to a Muslim, you would say, I understand, that Allah is God, and that's the truth of every truth to you. But just theoretically, if you found out that that wasn't true, are you more committed to the truth than to this? And we'd hope that they would say, well, of course I am. If there's more to this and you can convince me that, Jesus is God, of course I'll go to the truth. The truth is where it's at. And yet that's the one thing that Christians are unable to, like, that's the one thing that's completely blocked out as an option. If there's a list of options, that's never one of them. It's always an option to tweak your theology. If you go from Arminianism to Calvinism, as long as you get the gospel right, you are a sinner, Christ is your savior, you're covered by his righteousness
Yep.
alone. You're still going to get to heaven. You can tweak your even big tweaks, but as long as you get the gospel right, you need Christ to cover you. But in terms of the big picture, like, what if this entire book and worldview is completely wrong? And will you be willing to shift? And it's not even a discussion. It isn't like, well, maybe. It's like, it's not an option. Like, that's just, you might as well
It's just
ask me.
not.
Yeah, might as well ask me if there's a pink elephant in the room or something. It's just crazy. I did want to ask, I know I've taken up a lot of your time, and I appreciate you've answered so many of my questions. Recovering from religion is such a big part of your world. For anyone that doesn't know what it's about, could you first just tell us, what they
Sure.
do? And I'll have the links that, the website, as well as the phone numbers for anyone that
Sure.
gets their interest piqued and wants to directly
Sure.
contact them all. And then could you tell us maybe some of your, some of the personal parts of it, maybe that have meant a
Mhm.
lot to you as you've been involved with them?
Sure. Recovering from Religion was founded in 2009 by Dr. Darrell Ray. He's a psychologist, he was a former education minister, but he was in the religion, and he recognized the need for a place for people to go when he went through his deconversion process as an adult. He recognized that people need a little support, and he started with having a small group meet together in the back room, as he tells the story of an IHOP, and he just asked them one question: what these I'm not sure exactly how he got the group together, but the question was, how has your life changed since you left religion? And 3 hours later, they're still there talking. And we have we have such a need for those of us who were so immersed in religion to talk it through, and to talk to other folks who've had a similar experience. And he could see that there was a need for that. So he started, it's a nonprofit. Recovering from Religion, I mentioned earlier, our mission statement is so straightforward. We provide hope, healing, and support for folks who are struggling with issues of doubt and non-belief. We're not a deconversion process. It's always important for me to say that, because we market ourselves to folks who are questioning. And if we get the reputation for, don't call those people, they'll talk you out of your religion, they'll try to deconvert you. We don't do that. We don't want to do that. Religion does that, and we don't want to do that. We are also not professional therapy. We're peer support. So we have a 24-hour chat line, an internet chat, and we have a 24-hour telephone line, and it's all staffed by volunteers, most of whom have come out of religion, but not all. But they see the need for it. They're willing to give their time. They're willing to give their effort and a lot of their emotion to to talking these issues through, whether it's in an internet chat, like a chat room typing, or on the telephone call. And so we have folks from, as I've said, all over the spectrum, from every religion and from every point in the journey along that. Sometimes folks just need a safe place to ask their questions. I told you that you can question religion, but only in a certain context, and you only get certain answers, and we don't want to limit it to that. And we also, or it's a non-judgmental place to ask questions. You have doubts, that's fine. Someone may call and say, I something random or bizarre, I don't understand this part about Jesus walking on water. Oh, Okay, well, let's, tell me about it. Tell me what your beliefs are about it. Um, Sometimes we can point them in the direction of a website or a book or a podcast or something that would help them with that, with their questions. That may be the only encounter we have with them. They go on their merry way, and that's fine. Sometimes it's a little heavier than that. I just don't believe this is true anymore. I don't know what to do with it. We know that feeling, we know that sensation, both for the positive and for the negative. So our agents are trained to help ask some reflective questions. What do you see as your options? Where do you think you want to go with this? What do you think might be an outcome that you'd like to see? Just the usual benefit of talking through and helping people deal with it and providing resources. In addition to our 24-hour internet chat and telephone line, we have an online community. So after a chat, you may want to come inside. I use some illustrations here to come inside of RFR, where we have our online community. And in there, you could join any number of the groups. You can join LGBT, you can join ex-Jehovah's Witness, you can join ex-Catholic, you can join any of them. And in there, you are dealing and talking with and having a conversation with other folks that are on that little bubble of the universe. And so, people in different religions have shared language, they have shared experiences. You and I know what those Baptist words mean. And so people can join any of those groups that they want to and talk through some of their issues and make genuine friendships in there, and gives them a place, especially for folks who are in isolated areas. For the folks that are in one of 60 cities across the world, we have actual in-person support groups. They sometimes we train, a person steps up to volunteer to be a leader. We provide training for that, and they hold these support group sessions in different cities, usually in a library, and the group takes on what the leader. Maybe they meet once a month, maybe they meet twice a month, maybe they meet once a week, depending on the group, depending upon the dynamics of all that. And we provide, as I said, we provide training for the leaders so they can come together and they can actually talk to one another about where they're, where they are in their journey. And so we have that as an option as well. We do have. We have our professional therapists. We have it's a shoulder project. It's called the Secular Therapy Project. And it was born out of people seeking help. They come to us and they come to the conclusion they're going to need some professional help. Therapy is so important. And so we saw also, here's another organic moment when we saw a need to build a secular therapy project. Secular therapy, it'd be wonderful if every therapist was a secular therapist and provided evidence-based therapy, but that's unfortunately not the case. And you may be doubting, you may think, I need to talk to somebody, I need some therapy. And I think this person doesn't look too religious. It's not overtly religious. I look at Yelp and it's not too bad, but you get in there and you've gone through a session or two or three and you've unloaded and you've become emotionally attached to this person and you've done your whole story. And this therapist says you have a spiritual problem, or you need to get on your knees, or you need to find a good church home, and you are just devastated. The Secular Therapy Project does all of that vetting beforehand. We research reviews, we research websites, we research education. There is a professional vetting committee that processes those applicants to the Secular Therapy Project as therapists, and it could be social workers, marriage and family counselors, whatever. They vet them to ensure they provide only evidence-based therapy, and they become part of our database. And then when a client reaches out and says, I live in Cincinnati, I can drive about 50 miles, and I've got a teenager that needs a little bit of help, we match those folks up. The reason that secular therapists can't hang out a shingle that says, hey, I'm a secular therapist, is because in many areas they would lose half their clientele, because Christian people need therapy too. Like all of us. But when you put that word with it, religion has done such a great job of demonizing that word secular that they would lose. They can't. Therapists unfortunately can't do that. It's not that they're trying to be secret about it. And some therapists have done it in spite of it. I'm a secular therapist. I provide only evidence-based therapy. I'm happy to work with religious people, but this is what I provide. Some people have the luxury of being able to do that. They may be in a metropolitan area or a more progressive area, and they can do that, but a great number can't. So we provide this database. So that's our professional therapy. We have, since the pandemic began in March of 2020, we have every Monday night, we have a a presentation. We call it RFRX, a prescription for coping, because we did the little play on words with RX as a prescription for coping. And it started out as just everybody's going to be locked down for a while. We're going to be in our homes. How can we continue to communicate? How can we continue to help people? And we have presentations by different folks. Dr. Ray has given one. We've had everybody in the secular universe come and talk to us. Seth and Mandisa and all the big names that are in the secular universe come and do a presentation. And then we have a hangout afterwards. We have 100 folks or so attend by Zoom and get to ask questions of some of these folks. And the presentations are across the spectrum on what they might be, but they're all related somewhat to recovering from religion. So we have that as an opportunity too. And once again, that was an organic outgrowth of where we felt like there was a need at the time. So that's the recovering from religion thing. It has meant the world to me, because I think of it in terms of how much it would have meant to me had it been around when I most needed it. I did my deconversion about 15 years ago, which was before it was a twinkle in Dr. Daryl's eye. And I think about, because I was in the South and in an isolated area, and I was so religious, and my entire community was religious, I think it would have meant to me to be able to go to a website and see that little chat bubble and ask the question, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. My kids are leaving. I don't think I believe this anymore. My entire life is built around this with my marriage and my community. What do I do? And while they couldn't have given me an answer, and while, as you said, you don't know what the last chapter is, you don't know you're going to come out the other side okay, it would have helped me to just talk it through with someone who was compassionate and patient and thoughtful, which is what our trained agents are. So it's a very personal thing for me to be able to have the pleasure and joy of being the executive director. We have hundreds of trained volunteers who do this because of this, for whatever their motivations are, but pretty consistently, that's what the reason is, that they see a need for it. They see that they can help folks. We don't track our people. You're anonymous when you come in, and we don't say, well, how are you now? What do you believe now? We don't do any of that kind of thing. It's all anonymous. Even at our Monday night meetings, information of which can be found on our recoveringfromreligion.org website. You can turn your camera off. You can have an alias. You don't have to be part of it. You don't have to ask questions. You can just listen. So we try to respect our not only our clients' identity, and of course we would protect that, and that's all private and it's not revealed to us, but also the process. We respect that everybody makes this journey. You're not alone, but at the end of the day, this is a decision that you have to make, and this is a conclusion that you have to draw. So it's been, I do big important things as a lawyer, not to get too melodramatic. And recovering from religion is still one of the highlights of my life. It's a joy and a pleasure to be part of it. It's a joy and a pleasure to watch what happens in the lives of our volunteers as they feel like you and I say, they're giving back a little bit instead of contributing to the issue, that they're starting to clean it up a little bit. And it's a joy and a pleasure to watch clients come in despair. And while they still have the same hot mess when they leave, they have gotten it out. They've gotten some resources. They've gotten some assurance that they're not the only ones that are going through this. So.
Well, I know when I went through mine, I did call myself at least twice. And you mentioned that they're open 24/7. That was very true. And I had someone from Australia calling me late at night, and someone from Ireland early in the morning another time. And it's amazing. And you think too about the people that maybe live in a country where it's not safe to be talking to anybody, where literally, if you ask certain questions, you'll be in prison probably, or worse. And it's a great source. It was interesting for me. I was so enraptured by the idea of the comparative mythology that I'd come across, that even though I felt like I needed the emotional help, I somehow was able to, I was just like, I just got to figure out where this thing came from. And I don't know if you ever feel like that, but sometimes it's like the recovering from a Stockholm syndrome, where you're like, I know I'm out now, but like, who was this captor? And I was like, I've got to figure out what Christianity really was. I knew enough to know what it wasn't, but that became like, I called a few times for more of the emotional help, the support of it. And then just within a few weeks, I was like, I've got to become involved in helping people understand where did this thing come from? And that's a big part of my long-term passion. But um, going back to Recover from Religion, can I ask, when you talk to people, or just, when you're getting counselors set up to talk to people, a couple of big issues come up, and I just wanted to hit on them, and then we'll wrap up. One of them was the idea of the grieving process. When you talk to people that are grieving, and by the way, I apologize, there's a little background noise here, but when you talk to people about the grieving process, the issues of people feeling alone, people feeling like they need to, quickly recover, and it's like, some of this is, you mentioned, it's deep, it's going to take a while. Even the issues of the freedom to ask some of these hard questions. How do you help people in your conversations with people to just get through this grieving process that so many people do end up going through?
I think I think the very first step is to recognize that it is going to be grieving. You and I both have these fabulous narratives about that feeling, that sensation of freedom, and that's awesome. And it was very genuine for me. And I hope these folks get to experience it. But if we discount and negate the the grief that you have to go through first, it is a grief to lose. You think you have an eternal parent who adores you, who would kill his son for you. You think you have this thing. That's a grief process. You get to the point where you put it in perspective and it's a bad system. But in the beginning, you're losing the love of that parent. You're losing being the adored child. You're losing that there's a plan for your life, that in spite of all the chaos and not understanding it's there, you just may not know what it is. That's a grief process. And I think that acknowledging that and making space and room for people to have to do that grieving, and the terror, the fear of not having the plan and the fear of not having the parent. It's not just the sadness, but it's the fear as well. I think giving people space for that, acknowledging that, and not rushing them and not trying to say, yeah, but it's so great on this side. You and I want to do that. And I have to resist the urge to do that all the time. It's so much better on this side. It's so much better. It's so much better. It doesn't feel like it's so much better when you're where they are. So I think we have to, and that's part of our training, is to let our folks know, whatever your personal experience was. We actually have a policy that we don't do a lot of as agents, as trained agents. We don't do self-disclosure. In other words, we don't tell our story. If whoever you talk to in Ireland and Australia, and I love that you had a positive experience, we try to get our agents to understand we can't center it around us and our experience. And it's unique to everybody's experience is their own, and whatever worked for you. Don't tell your coming out story about how you told your mom. That's irrelevant and it's not helpful. So we don't do self-disclosure, because it's all about where the client is coming from. Now, that's why we created our online community, because these folks were hungry for a shared experience. And because we restrict our agents from telling their personal story, there was still this piece of hunger left. So we created this online community so they can share with other clients who have had a similar experience, and that fulfilled that need. But we have to be careful as agents that we give space for those, and sometimes for unexpected emotions and things, grief and sorrow and fear and rage. There's a lot that you're going to experience. Maybe not everybody, everything, and maybe not in a linear fashion, but there's all kinds of things happening, as you and I both know. And they happen at weird times. We'll have someone reach out to the helpline. They may have been a non-believer for years, and all of a sudden, maybe because of politics or because of what's going on or because something their mother said or whatever, it raises its ugly head in those little holes drilled into your brain, and it comes back up again. And so we try to be prepared for the fact that trauma, even if you haven't crossed the threshold into trauma, you've just had the indoctrination, can manifest in unexpected places in unexpected ways. So we try to be completely aware of that, and which is why working with recovering from religion is so terribly gratifying, is because this has been such an organic growth to be able to fulfill the need for what people need whenever they start that whole process or make that journey in that direction.
You're mentioning the whole idea of the emotions of it. I would imagine too that for some people, this is just a common thing I'm sure you've heard many times too, but that lingering fear of hell. Like you know that it's mythology. You can even read the words, like it'll say this is, in Greek the word Tartarus or Hades. Like we know mythologically where those words came from. But when you get it drilled into your head, as you said, you can still, or the rapture or whatever, but you can still wake up in the middle of the night thinking, like, what if this, the
What if
what
I,
if
yep.
somehow, and yeah, there's a lot of emotions that go in, and the anger as well.
When I present, and I do occasionally in secular conferences, when I present about recovering from religion, I like to participate with the audience and ask them that, what do you think is the main thing that people come to recovering from religion helpline for? And that's always one of the first guesses, is lingering fear of hell. And it's valid. It's not the number one, but it's very valid. It's up in the top 3 of reasons that people come. The top one, and it won't surprise you, but the top one is fractured relationships, because religion has planned ahead, and they know, especially some religions more than others, Jehovah's Witness, Mormons, different ones, there is a process in place for apostates, and so those fractured relationships, they're devastating, and sometimes they keep people in. You and I probably can name people who we know are not believers, but who have stayed, for the sake of a marriage, for the sake of a family, for the sake of an aging parent, for the sake of whatever, fill in the blank, the unity with their children, whatever it is. It's um, it's we have to be ready when people reach out to us for where it is they're coming from, and give people the space to begin to identify at least that that's what they're doing. But the fractured relationships is the number one reason that people reach out to us. It seems to be consistent in almost all of our chats. There's a lot of heavy lifting to do, as we identified earlier, of losing the eternal parent, of losing the plan for your life, of losing the ritual of religion, of losing the community, of losing the sensation of being pulling the boat in the same direction. We're trying to save the world, all of that. That's a lot of loss and a lot of drama that accompanies that. But on a real personal level, it's all about the relationships.
Yeah, and that, you're right. Fracturing is very close to home, and it's very painful. It's very, very painful, and I have people reach out to me every week who, some of them say, I'd love to be a guest, but I can't, and
I
it's for
can't
the
do it.
exact reason you said. It's, if I share this with anybody, it's going to be bad. It's going to be really bad, and it's going to be bad fast. And one
Yep.
of the things, I'll just mention this, and then I wanted to give you a chance to wrap us up. But one of the things that's been shocking to me is there are verses in the Bible that talk about what you do with an unbeliever, meaning you win them back through, love, through good behavior. Um, but that's not what actually happens. There's no sense of, well, now that you've left, we need to just love you back. The reality is, I would compare it very similarly to, if you imagine someone was in the upper echelons of the North Korean government and then they defected and escaped the country. They are absolutely a traitor, and you are never going to be in their good graces. They're never going to paint you in some good sense. And it's very similar, I would think, to someone who, was actually a, real defector in that sense, or someone who had been a traitor in some interpersonal relationship sense, where there's just no way, you're sleeping with the enemy, so to speak. You are, we, either you are secular and liberal and, horror of horrors, into these crazy non-biblical concepts, or you're into something demonic. And there's no way to paint the picture as you're a good person, and there's no way that you can have any kind of morality because you don't have God, and so you do become, as much as they might on paper want to say, I really want you to come back and I want to love you back, the reality is you're a traitor, and they're going to treat you as such. And I get it, because I was in that, so it's not like it's a shocking concept. um, I'm not sure what I would have done if it was, similar, because ironically, I didn't know anyone who'd ever deconverted before I did, which is weird. But you know you you face people every day that they're saying, I know how bad this is, and, or maybe they did get vocal, and, it's too late to, cat's out of the bag now. You're getting whipped for it every day, and it's such a painful thing. And I just put out a video recently about the hate speech that comes from Christians, both in terms of just the actual speech that comes from them, every day, but also the hate speech of Christianity, where, God says, I am going to come in fiery,
Yep.
wrathful vengeance, and I'm going to get you, and, I'm going to dash your babies' heads against the rocks and all that. there's hateful stuff in the book, but then its adherents exhibit that hate very naturally and very consistently. And as much as liberal Christianity might want to say, well, you're just in the wrong denomination, they're not interpreting Christ and his love correctly. The reality is, if you look at the actual verses, they're very hateful verses, and it's all throughout Scripture from start to finish. And you can't you can't be that surprised when the followers of
when they
this
do it.
hateful psycho god follow their hateful psycho god. They're going to do hateful things. But yeah, it's so painful, and I just want to say, I feel for anyone going through it. I'm sorry for what you're going through. I know that my saying that doesn't make anything better, but I feel you, and I feel for the pain that people are facing. It's hard, and I really do hope that people can find a way to keep relationships, whole, and find peace, and certainly just to find thriving inside your own spirit through it, because it's not easy.
And I hope that they take advantage to reach out to us. It's recoveringfromreligion.org. The chat bubble is on every page of our website, and the number is 84. I doubt it. And so if you want to do a phone call, if you can't, if you'd like to schedule a phone call, you can go to the website. There's an option to schedule a phone call. You can have the chat. You can, any number of things. Any way we can help you, we can. And as Tim said, the best we can do is to say, you're not alone. You're not alone. This, many have made the journey. And even though it doesn't mean anything quite yet to you, there is life after religion. There is joy after religion. There's morality and all of the things after religion. So there's places, we hope you come to us for some support. We would love to be able to offer some support.
Well said. Could I ask, just to wrap this up, I wanted to ask you to, number one, if there's any questions I didn't ask that you wanted to mention, anything, but also you've talked about before your life goal, and correct me if I got this wrong, but I think the phrase that you use is to decrease suffering and increase the joy of others. Could you elaborate on that? What your life goal and what you do, why that's such a passion for you, and
Sure.
then anything else you want to add to wrap us up?
Okay. We touched on it, and some other time we can have this conversation. I ran for office in a very religious area in Tennessee for state office, and I've been an out and vocal atheist in my community for years, and so there was no hiding it. And my opponent turned that on me in a big way, and it was quite dramatic. And I do have a talk about it, but it was one of the upsides of running as an atheist in a rural, or I call it running heathen in Jesus land, was it was so foreign to everybody that in every podcast interview, every appearance, everything, I got asked the question, how can you be moral without, because it was so, it rattled them so much, because here I am and I'm happy and joyful and I'm running for office and we can do these things and whatever. And so they would ask me that question, and repeatedly over and over and over, I got to say where my morality comes from. I got to say that the well-being of my neighbors, whatever that means to you, whatever neighbor means to you, the well-being of my fellow person is what motivates me to do better. And increasing their joy and decreasing their suffering is a simplification of what my philosophy is on how I make my community a better place, how I spend my money, how I spend my time, how I do my job. All of those things are because I am a member of this human community. And I know that when we help one another, we all do better, the helper and the helpee, and we all do better. So it's been my informal philosophy. That's where the expression came from. I used it as trying to explain to people why I was doing what I was doing, because not because the glory of God, it was for this other reason. And so it's my philosophy. It's been my guiding principle to do what I can in the lives of the people that are part of the community, whatever that means, in order to do better. And I can't think of anything that I wish you had asked me. This has been an absolute delight and joy to spend this time with you and to talk all these things through, and to give me the opportunity to promote recovering from religion and what we can offer. And I hope your listening audience does take the time to reach out. And Tim, thank you for being as frank and as open and as vulnerable as you are when you tell your story and you tell, your narrative about how that experience has been for you. It touches the lives of so many.
Thank you for saying that. I really, really appreciate that. Yeah, it's been a joy to be involved in it, and I like you said before, it would have been nice if some things were in place when you deconverted, and it is such a cool thing to see that our society is opening up, and it's not too hard yet to, at this point, to find some support if you can just reach out, and a lot of Facebook groups, and obviously recovering from religion. Well, I just wanted to end by saying again, everyone, we've been speaking with Gayle Jordan, the executive director at Recovering from Religion. And Gayle, thank you, and thank you to Recovering from Religion and all the people there doing, both the big heavy lifting and just the people taking all these phone calls. It's, all hours of the day and night. So many important things. Thank you, thank you, thank you, and thank you for
Sure.
your journey. It sounds like it's been quite a journey.
It has been.
Thank you for sharing it with us. It means a lot. We appreciate
Tim,
it.
thank you. Thanks so much.